Hello, everybody. My name is Ashwin Ravi Kumar, and I teach environmental politics and environmental justice at Amherst College in the US. And I'm here today to present empirical findings from the Peruvian Amazon in the context of our present conjuncture dominated by imperialism to convince you that to protect tropical forests, global North climate justice movements, including degrowthers, need to adopt and ferociously advocate for climate debt repayment from the North to the South. So Israel's genocide in Palestine has revealed a vital pivot point in the structure of the world system. To maintain private accumulation for Western capital, the US and its allies are willing to invest untold billions of dollars per year in a campaign of brutal de-development. This includes genocide, mass murder, the abject razing of ecosystems, and isolating politically any alternative pole of capital accumulation, irrespective of the political tendencies of that resistance to the United States. So we all know that this is how imperialism operates. And when it comes to climate politics, eco-socialists who recognize that the total material size of the economy must come down, that is, degrowth eco-socialists, of which I consider myself one of, need a political line that can adequately grapple with the nature of this imperial beast. The good news is that we have a great framework already in place that is humane, that offers a vision of justice, and that is decolonial. And that is the climate debt framework that came out of the People's Climate Agreement in Cochabamba in 2009. So the climate debt framework, The climate debt framework is simple but analytically complete, and I think everyone should actually read the thing. But in a nutshell, it calls for addressing unequal ecological exchange and redressing colonial harm with payments from the North to the South to the tune of 4% of GDP annually without any conditions. But in reality, that is not at all how the world works. Instead, ecological economists have shown very convincingly that every year, whether we're talking about land or labor or water or energy, there is a massive drain of wealth, a sucking sound every year to the tune of trillions of dollars of wealth from the South to the North. So very much not how things are going overall. When it comes to conserving tropical forests in particular, and preserving tropical forest ecosystems that play a vital role in regulating the Earth's climate system, the dominant ecological politics have so far been wholly inadequate to dealing with these sorts of issues. These interventions have included at-base programs like UN RED, newfangled things like the LEAF program, maybe some of you have heard of these, essentially market-based mechanisms that try to use carbon markets in order to address tropical deforestation. And in addition, the old 19th century classic modes of addressing ecological contradictions, protected areas. So despite strong evidence that these programs don't really work that well, we've seen a barrage of very cute upgrades and expansion packs over the years to try to make these softer, kinder, gentler, more participatory, and even more indigenous. Some of the big backers of these types of programs are my boys over here, Amazon, BlackRock, Delta, all of the big, the whole gang is really behind this in full force, right? So that's who's trying to advocate for this stuff. Now, in the context of the Peruvian Amazon, this kind of lands in the form of a range of different programs that end up kind of hitting the ground. And in a second, I'll present some of our quantitative results about how funding social services, recommoning care, and investing in basic needs of people can actually work to address deforestation through a climate debt framework. And this research was really animated by some field observations. So back in 2022, while I was carrying out work in the Shipibo communities of the Cayuria Basin in Peru's Pucallpa region, this guy right here, Omer Mori, said, "Environmentalists call us model communities, but in practice, we are forgotten." What he was referring to was the fact that in 2019, him and a bunch of other leaders from the area were flown out to New York to receive the prestigious UN Equator Prize. They were taken to fancy galas in New York, lauded by the international eco-technocracy, as Omer himself put it to me, inducted into a sort of international indigenous eco-bourgeoisie for their brilliant use of technologies, drones, GPSs, volunteer labor and patrols, things that were funded by environmental nonprofits in order to make conservation possible for them. This was at striking odds with the reality of their communities, which languished without clean water in perennially flooded lands, leading to acute health crises, even as the state had continued to reduce the availability of pediatricians, of OBGYNs, really continuing to enclose the so-called commons of care in a way that the environmental nonprofits and state agencies apparently found perfectly orthogonal to their conservation work. So these flooded communities have things like Wi-Fi, but nowhere to go to the bathroom is kind of the upshot of all this. But meanwhile, down the road, in a non-indigenous set of communities that live under non-collective tenure arrangements, where do we do see services, we do see healthcare and education, and it's funded by agribusiness. So agricultural agrarian capital is doing the things the state is not doing in a lot of these communities, and is doing the things that environmental conservation nonprofits from the global north are not interested in doing either.
Sorry, I just have to interrupt. At one time there is someone that will come to take photo. Are you okay with that?
Yes.
Doesn't want to be taking any photo? You're a good time, sorry.
Thank you. Okay, so this sort of thing leads to the question, can funding basic services through a climate debt framework actually be effective at reducing deforestation rather than these types of approaches that see conservation as a matter of technology and giving indigenous peoples the tools that they need to conserve forests without attending to basic needs? So we carried out a spatially explicit regression model to test this using disparate data that's kind of deliberately hard to find from the Peruvian government. And we found that when you control for all the things, yes, indeed, there is a strong correlation between district level expenditures on sanitation, healthcare, education, and lower deforestation. That includes proximity to roads, that includes integration with markets, it includes a lot of assumptions about regional political economies. Happy to say more about the details later, but I would say that this is already far more convincing than any of the neoliberal market-based conservation tools that are out there, and indeed most of what protected areas, including their sort of more inclusive and participatory incarnations, have been able to achieve. Why might this be the case? So in order to illustrate how this might happen, I'm going to share a little bit of what we saw from field work in a couple of different communities. So this is two ecologically similar communities that I think shed light on this. So the first one was the district of Puerto Bermudez. This is an upland area in the high jungle where people grow coffee and cocoa and rely heavily on cash from selling cash crops to meet their basic needs. When we asked people about their visions for the future in this place, they reliably told us that the tinkerings of the payment for ecosystem services schemes offered by the state were not a vehicle for achieving their aspirations. Instead, they aspired to expand cash crop cultivation and hire outside labor as part of that. In short, the vision of the future here was agrarian capitalism, right? Down the road, in another community that is ecologically similar, has a similar population density, grows similar crops, similar market integration, people had a very different reality. And the reason that they had a different reality here is because these communities in the Echavate district of the Cusco region sit atop the titanic Camisea natural gas fields. And as a result, gas levies have made their municipal budget about 10 times bigger than that of Puerto Bermudez. Now, not all of that goes to the rural periphery of these places. A lot of it gets lost to, straight up embezzlement. Much of it is invested in the urban areas, but some of it has gone to supporting clinics, etc. And perhaps even more strikingly, one of the things that a leader told us there is that the most beneficial thing that we've done, far more than dealing with any PES schemes or anything like that, was directly turning off the valves to the natural gas pipelines in 2006, forcing the companies to treat with us on far more favorable terms. So this has gone some way towards giving them funds for things like healthcare, things like education, and basic infrastructure. And so when we ask people here, what kind of a future do you aspire to, virtually no one is interested in expanding cash crops and pursuing an agrarian capitalist future. Instead, there's a lot more interest in working with conservation agencies and pursuing a more diversified set of subsistence-oriented livelihoods. All of that, though, is backstopped ultimately by fossil capital, which produces a big problem for global conservation and environmental movements. So we have strong evidence for the climate debt framework actually working, and an argument that extending even a modicum of social democracy to these peripheral areas can have profoundly positive ecological consequences. But let's be clear here. We are attempting to do something like recommoning care through a framework of climate debt. That is going to be met ferociously with resistance from the ecological technocracy, right? There are no side events at the UNFCCC COPs about just giving away healthcare as a matter of environmental policy. No, that is seen as fully orthogonal to the task of environmental action, right? But you do have all these guys arrayed around the presently hegemonic eco-capitalist programs like the LEAF Coalition and other successors to, global carbon market, Red Plus style stuff. And so with Palestinian resistance right now, exposing fissures and cracks in the world system, which is where we started this with, it is clearer than ever that we need a revolutionary reorientation of the world system. And so for those of us who are positioned adjacent to the halls of eco-discourse, I would suggest that we have a moral obligation and a political obligation to adopt the climate debt framework as a core organizing principle going forward. I would suggest that the global climate justice movement, including degrowth as a movement, has not yet advocated for the climate debt framework loudly and uniformly enough to force this contradiction to the surface, where mass movements, revolutionary parties, and especially class-conscious peasant and indigenous formations in the global south can seize it as a pole in revolutionary vision to whatever degree it is helpful. Free Palestine, thank you.
Okay, so we do have 5 minutes left for your session. So
Okay.
if we're gonna open up for question and answers, one of those. So anyone wanted to ask some questions to Ashwin? Oh, sure.
Hi, Ashwin. I'm from Peru,
Yeah.
and thank you for your presentation. I was wondering if this research has been shared yet, and if you're in contact with Debt for Climate, that there are
Yes.
movements trying to
Yes.
get that cancelled for
Yes.
the Amazonian countries in 2025.
Absolutely. So I'm not yet in contact with them, although I've talked to a few people here about that. This is written as a draft paper that's like pretty much ready to go, and I would love to connect with them about this.
I can
That's
connect you if you want that.
hell yeah. Thanks.
Maybe something like a bit practical about organizing. So I've both been in like the pro-Palestinian movement in Denmark and in Debt for Climate, but like it's hard to get like funds, especially for the Debt for Climate. There's a lot of momentum and a lot of mobilization in the Palestine movement, so that's more easy. But like, yeah, how to connect those two?
Yeah,
Do you have any-
definitely.
yeah.
I mean, ultimately, this is all, the need for climate debt is there regardless of whether or not this
Yeah.
fucking regression analysis says that it reduces deforestation, right? It's a moral and political obligation. But there are wonks out there that like these kinds of arguments, and I think there can be, it helps again to show that this does work and then force them to say no to it. And in that way really heighten the fact that people are not interested in doing climate debt and use that as something that can actually agitate people, provoke people, mobilize people. That's the best guess that I have.
Thank you for your presentation. I'm also from Peru, and I have a question regarding the role of the Peruvian government. You had mentioned during your presentation that it was hard to access certain data for your paper. So I was wondering, considering this context of political instability and lack of transparency when it comes to information and science, when it comes to climate, how can you picture like the collaboration between the Peruvian government and indigenous communities in order to achieve such a climate framework that you were talking about?
That's a great question. So in terms of the data, we had one of my students wrote a really beautiful set of scripts that just crawled all these totally opaque databases to put stuff together. We're gonna make all that public online. It's actually already kind of on her personal website that I can share. But then in terms of how the state is gonna engage with this stuff, so the flagship Payment for Ecosystem Services program in Peru is el Programa Nacional para la Conservación de Bosques, or National Forest Conservation Program, which aims to pay titled indigenous communities about 10 soles, or $3 per hectare, that they do not deforest relative to an agreed upon baseline. And this program has been pretty wonky and wacky in a lot of different ways, and fundamentally, they actually force communities that are enrolled in this program to invest those funds in certain agreed upon investment plans. Now, a lot of those are oriented, ironically enough, towards commodity production. And a lot of that is itself because the state does not conceptualize agroecology, indigenous agricultural systems, as productive. They're strictly illegible to it. So in their move to try to pay people to conserve forests, they also want to induct them further into green capitalism. Now, when I talk to people in the state that are, kind of the technocrats behind this, many of them well-intentioned and all that, they see the higher structure of the state, the Ministry of Economy and Finance in particular, which is kind of this super ministry in Peru that controls all of how programs are kind of implemented, as being a barrier to being able to release the reins a little bit and reduce the conditionality of these funds. But I think that advocacy within Peru, formations led by people like Veronica Mendoza some years ago, have at least taken this up to some degree and advocated for less conditionality of these things, but it's a long way to go.
Are you gonna hold the question?
Thank you, everyone.
Over?